Good evening, and welcome to the Why We Can't Wait, the Future of Blacks in America Intercollegiate Conference. I'm glad to see you all here this evening. I hope that the conference participants have been enjoying the activities. And right now, I'd just like to begin the next conference activity, namely a discussion on blacks in the American underclass. Before we begin, I should note a change in the conference agenda. Due to personal circumstances, Dr. Calvin Butts, who was to replace Reverend Dr. Samuel Proctor on the printed agenda, is unable to attend the discussion this evening. He sends his apologies. So, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you the moderator for tonight's discussion. She is the Director of Policy Analysis in Harvard University's Office of Government, Community, and Public Affairs, and a teacher and administrator at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. Ms. Muriel Morrison Spence. Thank you.
Much. I think I'm too short, but we'll manage. I just want to say a word about the format before I introduce the panelists. They are, as you know from your program, Professor Glenn Lowry from the Kennedy School of Government and Sylvester Monroe, who is presently one of the Los Angeles correspondents for Newsweek magazine. I'm sorry, for Time magazine. As you will find out, that's an understandable error. He has recently switched from Newsweek to Time. We're going to have each speaker talk for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to engage in a dialogue that involves not only them talking to each other and sharing some ideas, but also, as much as possible, sharing ideas, hearing from you, responding to your questions. The points that you raise when it's your opportunity to participate can either address points that the speakers have addressed in their initial remarks or related issues relevant to our topic. I want to remind you when we get to that point that you will be using the microphones that you see on the floor, and please, when that time comes, stand in line to them. I would try at the microphones. I would try to do some alternating so that the people at each microphone get approximate equal opportunity to speak. Please, when it is your turn, and I will repeat this later, be brief, and as you start listening and thinking up your questions, think up brief questions so that we can have a full opportunity for as many people as want to be heard and to hear responses to their questions. Another thing I think would be helpful, particularly because this is an intercollegiate conference, is if you would identify yourself and what campus you're from. I think that would add to our ability to get a sense of who you are, and I'm curious, frankly, to get a sense of who's here and what perspectives you bring to the discussion. We're going to end by 8:30. There's an printing error in your program that suggests we're going to be here till 10. I don't know about you, but I don't think I could take it for that long, and I'm glad to have been told that, yes, that was a mistake. I'm going to just give, as I do my introductions of each panelist, brief versions of what you have in your program. Often at conferences, they give you the program with everybody's bio, and then somebody stands up and reads it to you, which I have never thought was a good use of the time. First, I will introduce Professor Glenn Lowry. He will speak to you briefly, and then I will, after that, give a little biographical information on Sylvester Monroe. Professor Lowry is Professor of Political Economy here at the Kennedy School of Government. He's a Chicago native, got his bachelor's degree from Northwestern University in 1972 and a PhD from MIT in 1976. He taught at Northwestern and the University of Michigan before coming to Harvard, and has been a visiting scholar at several universities, including Oxford in England. He has published extensively in academic journals on topics in the area of economic theory, and is now completing a book on racial advocacy in the post-civil rights era. Professor Lowry?
Thank you very much. Welcome to those of you who are visiting Harvard's campus for this conference. The American Underclass. Here we are yet again. Another conference, another gathering. I've been to so many. We're all concerned. Some of us are angry. We're worried. We're befuddled. We want to talk about it. We want something done about it. It's a political question. You know, liberals and conservatives, the left and the right, people have lines on the problem. It's a question of race. It's the fruit, the bitter fruit of so many years, generations of racist American oppression of black people. It's a question of values, some say. It is a measure of the disintegration of community. It is the byproduct of progress. You know, those who could do well left, and what was left behind is what we see. And so we come to forums like this, we come to Harvard, people like me stand up in front of you and we're supposed to have answers. I don't have any answers. In fact, I'm here to see if I can't learn something from those of you who are going to have to be involved in the solution of this problem. I have some suggestions, I have some observations that might be useful in setting the tone for this discussion that you all will carry on here. Because if you're looking for somebody from this podium to tell you what to do, I'm telling you now, you're going to be disappointed. One suggestion that I'd like to offer is that this is less a political problem, at least in the straightforward sense of normal politics, less a problem of public policy than many would tout it to be. I don't think this is really about budget levels, although budget levels will be discussed, and budget levels are important, and we all have positions on budget levels, and we're going to get upset and emotional about budget levels, but I don't think it, at bottom, ultimately, is an issue of budget levels. I don't think it's a question of the complexion of the person who holds the mayor's office or the state rep, although, again, these questions will engage us, and we'll be excited about them. I think that we have to look a little deeper than that. I think that we have to have courage and candor as we look deeper. While we're looking deeply at this problem, at the reality of it, violence, murder rates, the vanishing young black male, the population of the prisons in the vicinity of any big city in any state in the country, or the drug trade, crack, the scourge of addiction, and what that implies. While we're looking with candor and honestly at the, quote, disintegration of the black family, very loaded term, we're going to be looking deeper than politics if we're looking in that way. We're going to be looking at a way of life as it's lived by some in our society. And if we think about how to transform it, how to address it, we're going to have to recognize the limitations of political tools and political rhetoric for addressing the problem. Not the irrelevancy. I don't assert that such tools are irrelevant, but I assert that they're profoundly limited. I assert that it's difficult to conduct a discourse about these problems in our society, a genuine discourse. I was quite struck at another one of these gatherings not too long ago here, Senator Moynihan present, and he was pushing his welfare reform package at that time. And I remembered the Moynihan of the 1960s and the urban problem and so forth, and poverty was being talked about, but somehow the urban problem in the inner cities didn't even really come up. And the point was that, well, if you count these inner city poor people, you know, they're only 6%, 7%, 8% of the poor. It's not really poverty was the point. The point was to delimit and set off to the side this intractable hard core of a problem so that we could then talk about poverty. That is, so that politics could be engaged. That is, so that conservatives and liberals could define something over which they could fight, about which they could talk in terms that they understood. They couldn't really, and this is no indictment of Senator Moynihan particularly, it's simply an observation about the fact they couldn't really engage the problem. Well, there's a spiritual issue here, and it is too bad that Reverend Butts isn't here to elaborate on that. There's a question of what moves people deep in their centers of motivation, what it is that gives people's lives meaning. There's a question of how parents relate to children, of how it is that neighbors relate to each other. I mean, of all the problems that we're talking about today, homelessness, child abuse, drug addiction, all the problems that have political manifestations. We also have problems of relationships among people. We also have problems of lives that have gone awry. I don't address this merely as an academic or merely with a disinterested distance and objectivity. I address it as a person who's lived enough life to know that lives can go awry, and to know that at the center of the restitution of lives lies some kind of spiritual idea, to know that the deepest motivations of people are extra political, to understand that when we convert the underclass into an objective category, when we make chits on the political chessboard that we move around driven by our own ideological agendas from comfortable postures such as we enjoy today, to know that when we do that, we squeeze out the essence of the lives that we talk about, and we deal only with the epiphenomena, only with the barest external surface. Who wants to go to, quote, the ghetto? Who wants to be with, quote, the underclass? Who wants to know the people that we would, quote, help? Who wants to talk not about the social relations of production, but about the social relations of helping, about the essential human questions of how do we maintain contact with our fellows? How do we really get the standing to intervene in people's lives? That's not much the subject of discussion at conferences like these, because usually the demonstration of our political correctness, of our progressive bona fides, takes precedence over the deeper, more profound, more troubling, more ambiguous, more maddening questions of the sort that I've been alluding to. Well, I hope that I will provoke you to engage some of those questions. And I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
We'll hear next from Sylvester Monroe. He is a Mississippi native who considers Chicago his hometown. Two people from Chicago. I'm very glad as a Philadelphian that Bill Gray gave someplace else a little time last night. He has served as White House correspondent for Newsweek magazine, as Boston bureau chief for Newsweek, and in the Chicago bureau at Newsweek as well. His reporting assignments have included coverage of the 1984 and 1988 Jackson presidential campaigns. A March 1987 Newsweek cover story called Brothers told of the lives of 11 friends of Mr. Monroe who were former fellow street gang members with him. It is now the title of a book that is available, I know for a fact, in a couple of Harvard Square bookstores. He's a 1973 graduate of Harvard, concentrating in social studies. Mr. Monroe?
Thank you, Muriel. Good evening. As Dr. Lowry says, here we are one more time talking about the underclass. Some years ago, I took a course here. Can't remember the title of it. It was taught by a man named Edward Banfield. He had just written a book called The Unheavenly City. One of the things that struck me back then was that we were talking about a lot of the same things that we're talking about today in the underclass. And all this, and he was sitting there, he stood there and he talked about these things, and it was and he talked about the sociology and the pathology of growing up in ghettos and whatnot. And it just struck me as I sat out there, I said, hey, wait a minute, he's talking about me. I'm a person, I'm somebody. And I think Dr. Lowry hit upon a very important point we should discuss tonight, that, what is the underclass? Who is the underclass? The underclass are people, and people who have lives and dreams and hopes and hurts and wants, just like other people. Unfortunately, a disproportionate number of them happen to be black, and they happen to live in places with names like the Robert Taylor Homes and Fort Greene Projects and places like that. A few years ago, the media, the American media, seem to rediscover poverty as if it had left us. I mean, it's been around for a long time. I mean, the things that we're talking about, E. Franklin Frazier talked about, Pat Moynihan talked about, Professor Banfield talked about, Bill Wilson in Chicago, and Dr. Lowry and many, many others have talked about and studied and worked on. But it's been around for a long time, but because of our popular culture here, I mean, this is a country of fads. One day, the hula hoop is in. The next day, green hair is in. Blacks are in one year, then they're out. Women are in one year, they're out. I don't know what's next. I think it was male earrings last year. And we talk about people in much the same way. I know what it's like in the media because I've worked in it for some number of years. And one of the things I hope that we can do today is, as we talk about the underclass, is to talk about the people. And it's been very rare that I've ever seen any study or any story to deal with the underclass or anybody else like that ever went to those people and asked them what they thought about their lives and the world as they saw it. Most of the time what happens is a reporter or a sociologist or whoever you might have goes there to the Robert Taylor Homes, for instance. I use that phrase for you, those of you who don't know. Robert Taylor Homes is the largest public housing project in the country, perhaps in the world. It's 28 16-story buildings that stretch for 2.5 miles on the south side of Chicago. At its peak, it had about 27,000 people in it, all poor, all black. Now it's about, the official number is about 19,000, but I will bet you that it's more than that because a lot of brothers, quote, end quote, don't get counted on purpose. But we go to places like that and you pass by, and as Dr. Lowry said a little while ago, I mean, who visits the underclass? Where are they? I mean, the Robert Taylor Homes is a place that most people will tell you that they see it's bordered on one side by the Dan Ryan Expressway, which separates it from part of Bridgeport, which used to be the home of the mayors, Dick Daley, Michael Bolandic, former mayors of Chicago. And it's at some parts 12 lanes wide. To the north is the Illinois Institute of Technology, very prestigious private school. To the south is more black ghetto, sort of. And to the east, more projects and a lake, Lake Michigan. It's a very isolated kind of place. And people will say to you, well, everybody knows the Robert Taylor Homes. And they say, well, yeah, I see it when I drive by the Dan Ryan on my way to work. But nobody would ever go there. And I submit to you, like Dr. Lowry, I don't have any answers, but I do have quite a few suggestions. And one of them is that everybody knows the pathology. We know about drugs and crime rates and all those other things, teenage pregnancy, so on and so forth. But before we come up with any kind of solutions, I think the people who live there, the people we're talking about, need to be consulted. And when I say consulted, I don't mean just, trot out the building spokesman when you go in and talk to somebody, and then that spokesman says something, you come back, and then you write a study or a news story that says, here are these people, and they do thus, this, and this, and this is why they are. I deal in perceptions in the media, and I think part of the problem, a major part of the problem, is perception, is how we view, how the so-called underclass is portrayed. Ms. Spence mentioned a Newsweek cover story that I worked on. It was called Brothers, as is the title of my book. I wanted to have, in 15 years at Newsweek, and it was okay if she said that I worked for Newsweek in LA, because I did spend 15 years there. In 15 years, I never turned down an assignment. It's just something you don't do. But as I say, in this whole process of the media rediscovering the underclass, there were a number of stories done, and one of them that stuck into my mind was Bill Moyer's CBS piece called The Vanishing Black Family. In that piece, one of the things that particularly struck me was that you never saw really any black men. And the black men that you did see were, well, let us just say that they did not come across in the best light. One of them was the one man who did come across was a young man named Michael, who had fathered 6 or 7, I can't remember, illegitimate children. And the interviewer asked him, well, Michael, why do you do this? And his answer, I believe, was, I guess I have super sperm. And they said, well, who's going to take care of these kids? He said, the state, I guess. Well, I'm sure there are plenty of Michaels. I think that was done in New Jersey. There are plenty of Michaels in Chicago, in New York, in Philadelphia, wherever you, but black men in the underclass and elsewhere are not all like Michael. But the media perpetuates that myth that black men, that's the way they are. As my grandmother used to say, trifling. Newsweek decided they wanted to get in on this new wave of interest in the underclass and decided that they were going to do the story right. They were going to do it from the point of view of black men. And they came to me, an editor came to me very excited and says, Vest, we're going to do this story about black men. We want you. And I said, oh? And he said, we're going to do a cover story on black men. I said, I don't want to be a part of it. And he was a bit shocked. And I said, I just don't. It's a subject for a sociological treatise. It's a book or whatever, but it's not going to be done justice in Newsweek. So I made this pitch to, I said, they said, well, how could we do it so that you would want to be involved? And an editor, who I still haven't figured out whether he paid me a compliment or not, said, well, you know, Sylvester Monroe grew up in the Robert Taylor homes, and we have in him a natural resource. I don't know whether that was a compliment or not, but he said he grew up there and he can go back there. Would you be willing to do that? I thought about it for a minute and I said, this still isn't going to work. But so I made all kinds of outrageous demands, and one of them was that I got to pick the reporting team that was going to go do it. The other was that I get to pick the photographer, because I said I would not be responsible for a white boy with $3,000 worth of cameras around his neck in the Robert Taylor homes. And third, that, and most important of all, that when we got through with the reporting, if the story did not reflect, if it did not say what I thought it ought to say, if it did not tell the story the way it ought to be told, because, in fact, what it was, I was going back to visit my friends, and these just weren't any subjects, that I had the right to kill it. Now, those are unheard of demands at Newsweek. And lo and behold, they said, you got it. So then I had to do it. My point is, in all of this, is that what I tried to do in Brothers in that cover story and in the book was to go to these people, to get behind the sociology. This is, Dr. Lowry, this is not a put down of sociology by any means. Sociology is very important. But we are all very familiar, as he said, with the pathology, with the sociology, the statistics of what life is like there. What I wanted to know was how these people saw the world, saw themselves, and what they felt. I wanted to hear their voices. I mean, and certainly to let Newsweek readers who never hear or meet anybody like that before would do. With that, we can talk about a lot more of these things, but that will basically be a point that I would like to try to get along, that perception is a major part of the problem, and the media, the perception of the media, continues a great many myths that make it almost impossible for us to really deal with the problem as it really is. Thank you.
This is great. They're honoring their time constraints. I'm going to give you a chance to ask some questions, and you can, in a moment, start lining up. But I want to put it back to each of the speakers for a moment, and I'd like to hear each of them. I'd like a dialogue between the two of you. I don't know if we can get that. But what I want to hear laid out before us right away, before we go any further and hear some of the audience comments, is I want to hear something about these issues with respect to black women. as you have both noted, we probably don't need to stand up and recite a series of statistics. But it is striking to me that there is a book about brothers, and maybe that, and a Newsweek cover story, maybe that tells us something about the media's willingness, or the publication industry's, the publishing industry's willingness to come at some of these issues that way. I don't know what it represents, but as a start, I'd really like to hear each of you bring the question of black women into the picture, and in that sense round out right at the beginning a little bit of our sense of who we're talking about. Either one of you can start.
Well, I'll be brief. You know, I mean, I don't have any deep insight here. I mean, there are the obvious things to say, like black women are on the front line, black women are having children, black women are suffering from abuse, that women are overrepresented among the poor, women and children are overrepresented among the poor, blacks overrepresented among those women and children who are poor. I could talk, if I were given to talk in sociological categories, which I'm not. I'm an economist, by the way. So it's okay to bash sociologists. But I mean, I could talk about the interaction between racism and sexism. I could talk about the fact that labor market opportunities for the women are less good even than opportunities for the men, and they have children to support. We could talk about child support and the difficulty in enforcing obligations for men to support their children. I'd be more inclined to invoke the voices of the black women who have written about the plight and circumstance of black women. Be they Sarah Lightfoot writing about her mother and her nobility and accomplishment, or be they Alice Walker or Ntozake Shange or something of that nature. Insofar as explaining the inattention to the circumstances of black women, I find that interesting in view of the fact that Vess was just making the point that Moyers didn't talk to any black men, so he must have been talking to somebody. Maybe we don't like what he had to say about the circumstances of those women. But viewed in a certain light, you could see that Moyer's piece as having been a fairly poignant portrayal of the plight of women, even if it was in some ways narrowly focused and inadequate in its coverage.
Can you pick up on could you pick up, Bess, on the comment about the Moyers story? Was it an opportunity for black women to be heard? And are we, in fact, inclined to negatively react because we just don't like what we heard?
I think that's part of it. One of the things, my negative reaction was that here was one, the lack of men, but the other was we always come through it, come at the subject through. I mean, the measures that we use in society. I mean, teenage pregnancy, single-parent families, mother-headed families. Those are generally the avenues at which we go. I mean, we never. I mean, how often do you see a television special in which you interview a black woman who is generally, as a result, a negative attention as a result of some problem like that, like teenage pregnancy or heading single-parent families?
I think one of the things that may be useful for us as we go on with the discussion is to add to this sense that the panelists have given us of our need to get to know the people we're talking about. We also need to think about the public policy questions that Congressman Gray brought to our attention last night. You can have a very legitimate debate about to what extent federal or non-federal tax money ought to be used to address some of the problems of the underclass. But I think one of the things we have to, in some way, take into account that it is a public policy issue. At this point, what I'd like to suggest is I want to have each of the panelists speak for a moment about some of the public policy issues or recommendations that they have, some of the public policy directions they either disapprove of or have some problems with, or some of the public policy recommendations they would favor. And as they're doing that, if you could begin to stand at the microphone, I'm going to remind you to be brief in your questions, but this is a good time for you to start. Take your place at the microphone and be candid. This is not an issue we have to tiptoe around. We can't afford to. It's probably the only time on this campus that you're likely to get a chance to talk about these issues with some candor, and I hope you'll feel free to do it. So while you're beginning to get ready to do that, I'd like to hear them speak to the public policy question for a moment.
One of the things that particularly bothers me as we deal with this issue is that, you know, black people, I mean, the underclass in absolute numbers, defined as that group of people who seem permanently stuck in poverty, in numbers is not predominantly black. It's blacks number in it disproportionate to the numbers in the population. Unfortunately, in this country, I think black people have become a metaphor for problems in this country. You want to do a story on crime, you get some black statistics. You want to do a story on drug abuse, you get some black statistics. You want to do a story on teenage pregnancy, you get some black statistics. You do a story on single-parent families, you get some black statistics. I submit to you that these are not black problems. They're American problems. And until they start to be viewed that way, then we're never going to sort of deal with it, because what we've happened, I mean, I don't like the phrase underclass, although I have a great deal of respect for Bill Wilson. I'm not sure he coined, did he coin the phrase?
Ken Arletta.
Okay. I don't like the phrase because it suggests that we are talking about some people too low to even deal with, someone below our regard. And that is the way that I think, in large part, in the Reagan administration, that they've been dealt with. These are not, I mean, you cannot just sort of deal with a group of people and throw them away as if they're some sort of human waste heap. I mean, leave them there, give them. I'm not suggesting a return to the wasteful 60s war on poverty, throw money at the ghetto kind of solutions, but I think there has to be a different kind of approach, and I think one of the approaches is not to look at the underclass as black.
You're in the media. How do you change that?
Well, now you're talking about a whole different, a major problem here, because one of the ways you change that is to get people who will look at it in a different way. Unfortunately, the media, all my bosses at Time and at Newsweek and in other places certainly do not come from the underclass, black or white, and they come with preconceived kinds of ideas about that, and the stories that they will do reflect those preconceptions. And what we have to do is kind of break out of those. We've got to get people who are willing to look at the problem from a different perspective.
I take it what you're saying, that if that could happen within the media, that some of the public perceptions would shift, and therefore some of the public policy
would have a chance to shift. I mean, I think the public. I mean, it's a tough nut to crack, but until the public perceptions change, I mean, just like my grandmother. I mean, until we decide that it's not just trifling black men that is a problem, that there are other components, there are other reasons for some of these things that are happening, then not much is likely to happen.
Professor Lowry?
Well, the thing is so massive. It's all, you've got jobs, education, housing, healthcare, crime, teen pregnancy. Let me say a couple of general things. I think that the issue here is not trying to save money. That if you add up the resources that are going to so-called underclass populations in terms of state and federal public services, you get a very small sum relative to not just the defense budget, but relative to the agriculture subsidy budget or relative to the Social Security transfer budget. I think the question is knowing what to do. I think there's some programs that are relatively promising. We've heard a lot of good things about Head Start and about various innovative Head Start-like early interventions that people talk about. And clearly, quote, breaking the cycle, close quote, by intervening with youngsters and trying to make a real difference in their educational prospects, if you will, compensating for deficits in their socioeconomic background that attend their conditions of birth, then that seems to me to be something worth doing. In the education area, there are a lot of proposals. They are controversial. Many systems and educational thinkers are moving toward a greater emphasis on choice and parental involvement in student assignment to schools, the idea being that greater competition among schools for students will have some effect on the quality of education. I doubt that it's as simple as that, although it seems to me that mechanisms of that sort are worth exploring. There was a report just recently about scattered public housing in suburbs for Chicago residents who qualify for public housing in the wake of the Gattro decision, finding the concentrated public housing of the sort that Robert Taylor represents as being discriminatory and illegal. And so families being subsidized to rent in the private market housing units in areas throughout the greater Chicago area, and the effectiveness of that program for those families, although the limited character of that program because of the financial resources involved and that sort of thing. A lot of interesting stuff going on in public housing. We have a fellow here at the Kennedy School, Harry Spence, who's been active in public housing in Boston and who's writing some interesting things about the possibilities for innovative management of public housing to help to build a more cohesive and orderly community for public housing residents, where they can have a greater chance to avoid a lot of the problems that attend public housing. And voluntarism of the sort that's represented by the resident management groups in public housing projects who have been so highly touted, and of the sort that I imagine people like Jack Kemp and George Bush will be talking about. But I want to say a couple of other things. I think as much as there may be a problem of perception, there's also a problem in the reality of the situation. It's a sensitive thing to talk about, but that really has to be dealt with. I mean, I listened to Sylvester Monroe say when he was sitting in Banfield's class and Banfield was talking about the underclass, that he was talking about me. Well, that didn't really, I didn't understand that. I mean, he was talking about people who were black, but he was also talking about people who were in various ways not like you. And those differences between you and them are the relevant differences for public policy, not the sameness of your race. So that, this becomes very clear if you talk about crime and criminal justice policy. Everybody's not the same. I mean, some people are actually dangerous offenders. How you deal through public institutions with the fact that people's behavior differs, and in some ways that differences makes impossible the order that other people require in order to live comfortably and have progress, is all the is the heart of the matter. That discriminating between persons on the basis of their behavior and how that's done becomes very important.
When you're talking about criminal...
I wanted to suggest best respond to that, and then we've got a number of questions. We'll turn to those.
Yeah, when you're talking about criminal behavior, yes. But there, take the difference between, one of the questions that I always get asked is, well, you know, you lived in Robert Taylor Homes and one of 7 kids, mother-headed family. You got out, you went to Harvard. Why can't the rest of them? And the implication is the rest of them are trifling. And that's just not true in every case. I got some breaks. I happened to be in the right place at the right time a couple of times, and I had some things that perhaps some of the other guys didn't. Some of those things were, and they're not great big mysteries. They're nurturing from my family. And it didn't have to be 2 parents. I mean, one parent, I mean, whoever, a coach, somebody who sets you on the right path. But there were some guys who had the same thing. Their parents loved them no less, and yet they still didn't quite, the things didn't quite come together. And a lot of that is, I mean, the 60s, I mean, part of it was the time that I grew up, that you grew up. I mean, I think we're contemporaries. Is that there was no greater time to be black in this country than in the 1960s. In the wake of the King assassination, doors of opportunity swung wide open. And those of us, some of the Glenn Lowrys and Sylvester Monroes, who were in the right place at the right time and had a number of things come together, were able to take advantage. I have some friends who were not criminals, were not drug addicts, but those things didn't come together. So we're not just talking about criminal behavior here. We're talking, and then those doors closed again very quickly. An example of, I mean, right here, my class at Harvard, 1973. The number of black males in that class, I think it was never as large, and it has not been as large since. In fact, it has gone down pretty much since then. Why? I mean, there are answers to that. But all I'm saying is that when we talk about these differences, we can't talk about, I mean, it's not just, you know, good guys and bad guys.
Let me give people a chance to start asking their questions. I'll start over here and then alternate.
Good evening, Dr. Lowry and Mr. Monroe. We have repeatedly spoken tonight of how we know the pathological studies, we know the results, and yet I find myself frustrated that repeatedly you gentlemen return to those same studies and those same statistics. What I want to know from you, and what I think many of us here want to know from you, is what we are going to do about the plight of the underclass in America. I have worked in Academy Homes, which is a project in Boston, for the past year, and I have gotten to know these victims, which is what Dr. Lowry has suggested that we do. I want to know from you gentlemen what you suggest that we who are making it and we who will make it should do to help our brothers along the way.
I think you should keep doing what you're doing.
That's a very good suggestion for me.
One thing.
However, I think that the issue is more important than for us to give very succinct answers to. I want a more elaborated, more detailed plan of how we should address the problems of the underclass in America.
I didn't mean to be flippant if I sounded that way. I don't have such a plan. I want one too.
There are some,
you know, I'm willing to listen to Vest if he's got one.
There are some
I don't
things.
have.
There are some things. When Dr. Lowry says just what you're doing, you said you work in this in a program somewhere, you work in this housing. That's very important. One of the things that has happened, and one of the things that we've seen that's happened, is the success of the black middle class. The growth of the black middle class is one of the things that has exacerbated the plight of the so-called underclass. I mean, I no longer live in the Robert Taylor Homes. Nobody in his right mind would live in the Robert Taylor Homes who didn't have to. By the same token, I think that those of us who got the breaks, who were lucky enough, who get a Harvard education, we have an obligation and a responsibility, especially for the children. I mean, look at what's happening in this city and cities all around this country, in LA, to the children, the kind of violence going on, and the impact of drugs. I mean, the Robert Taylor Homes was a bad place when I was there. There were gangs. I mean, we were all in gangs. I mean, we were pretty in gangs back then. Sure, people got hurt. I mean, we were tough in our own minds. Well, we didn't have Uzis, and the impact of drugs was not the same. We have a responsibility to go back and make, I mean, Dr. Lowry and Sylvester Monroe, we have a responsibility not just to live where we live and lecture at Harvard and work at time and never be seen and never go back. We have a responsibility to be seen as living viable role models to those young kids to show them that they can be and do something other than that. You know, just because they can't dunk a basketball like Michael Jordan or sing a love song. I don't think Michael Jackson can dunk. Like Michael Jordan or sing a love song like Michael Jackson, that they don't have to turn to crime. Now that's not easy. I mean, how do you go up to a kid these days? And I've seen it in Washington D.C. where I used to live and other places, and tell them and tell some kid, well, stay in school, you know, work hard, and you come out and you can get a job and you can you know, have a nice family and all this. And he'll get out and I had this kid tell me, he says, man, what you talking about? It's chump check. I could steal that much, you know, in an hour. And with drugs, you've got kids coming out. I've seen kids peel off. I mean, but if you're not there, I mean, that was the difference between one of the people in the book I wrote, Hunk Johnson, who was my brother-in-law, my age. I mean, we were like 2 weeks apart. And Hunk became a hustler on the street. And that's because he looked around and he saw no possibility. I mean, he saw no possibility that he could, as he says, he put it, wear the kind of big hats and tailor-made clothes and drive the kind of cars that he wanted to drive. Nobody, he said, was going to give him a job to make that kind of money. I mean, he bought racism. Now, racism is not the answer. I want to say this right now. Racism is alive and well in this country. But racism is not the entire or most of the problem that black people face. I mean, there's certain things that, you know the song, Mama may have, Papa may have, but God bless the child that's got his own. There are certain things that black people in their communities must do. And one of them, as I say, is to provide those kinds of role models, to be there, not live there. No, you don't have to live in the ghetto to do that.
Okay,
but that's one thing.
I'm going to shift to the other side. I don't think we'll have a chance for follow-up questions. I wish we could, but I think I'm going to have to ask that you ask one question and we get some response, and then I'll have to go to someone else. Over here.
Mr. Monroe, you mentioned both that most of those in the underclass are not black, and that the underclass is perceived as black, and that what we have to do is shift the mentality from considering this a black problem to considering it a problem of the United States, an American problem, if you would. Well, I was at a seminar this afternoon in which we were discussing AIDS and how to address AIDS and how to inform the communities at risk. And one conclusion of the seminar, as I understood it, was that as long as AIDS is just considered an American problem, in fact, it's considered a white problem, and the specific needs of the black community, of the Latino community, of women's communities, of various communities that aren't white male and perhaps gay in this case, are not being addressed, and that the language isn't adequate, et cetera, et cetera. And these two ideas seem to be very contradictory, and I wonder if we're looking for a balance of approaches, or if it's really a choice, and how you would choose that.
We're looking for people to look at things the way it really are, and not, I mean, the two problems there that you talk about, I mean, most people in this country who have AIDS are not black. On the other hand, the problem in the black community is critical, is severe, and as long as black people walk around saying, well, that's not, I mean, I don't have to worry about AIDS because I'm not gay. I mean, then that's a major, I mean, that's a very serious problem. So we have to look at, I mean, we have to be informed. I mean, we have to educate ourselves or be educated to look at things as they really are, not hide behind easy answers and easy sort of stereotypes, because it's easy to, I mean, some uninformed person say, well, you know, I'm black, I don't have to worry about AIDS because I'm not gay. It's white gay people that's got AIDS, and it's not true.
Another question over here.
Yes, gentlemen. To the two of you, very briefly, I was wondering if you could list some of the most self-perpetuating aspects of the characters of the majority of the poverty-level blacks, and then propose how you combat it, in addition to explaining what effect the media has on poverty-level blacks and the way they both view themselves and the way they act, and how extensive and significant you think those aspects are. And if you can slide in, I'd just like to know a number. How many of the poverty-level blacks currently in America live in projects? I'd just like to know.
You want to do the first part?
That's a lot. Self-perpetuating behaviors, well, poor educational performance, where you know that parents' involvement in early cognitive development of children is important, and where something like early intervention through Head Start seems to be a useful intervention. But what I didn't really fully follow the question. There was some other stuff in there.
Before that, there are certain, when you were talking about the distinction between yourself and other blacks who are in the underclass, you said it was not a racial thing. You seemed to imply that there are some inherent traits about those people that would relegated them to the levels of what we're going to call the underclass.
I meant that in all racial groups, distinctions among people can be made on the basis of patterns of behavior that affect what their economic outcome is. I mean, the success in educational institutions is fostered by people's ability to play that game. And whether or not you regard those traits as intrinsic or inherent, it's obvious that human populations differ in the ability to play that game. And that those differences are not racial, but they are differences among people that affect the likelihood that a person is going to be self-supporting or employable or whatever.
I was just wondering if you knew
I'm going to have to play moderator and give Mr. Monroe a chance to speak to the initial question, and then we'll have to switch to the other side. It's a very far-reaching question, and I think perhaps some of the other questions we'll get at some of it as well. But let's just take a moment for Mr. Monroe and then go to the other side, the other mic.
I think part of your question too was that you were talking about these traits, but also was the media's.
Like from those individuals that are in the.
Well, the media kind of perpetuates. I mean, you want to ask for some examples. There is a perception in this country that black men, blacks, and particularly black men, are less intelligent, less productive, more violent, more dangerous than the rest of society. If you buy into those perceptions, that affects a great deal of what you can do. It affects whether you're going to be hired, whether you're going to be able to get a place to live, go apply for an apartment or a house. It affects a great many things, because if people perceive you as less intelligent, less productive, more dangerous, more violent, then they're going to make decisions about employment and housing and based upon that. And the media doesn't until lately, and even now, hasn't done much to dispel that.
Okay, over to this side for a question.
Hello. Dr. Lowry, you've made some interesting comments about what I would call one half of the underclass problem, which is education and other issues relating to the economic success of blacks and other underclass members. I wonder if you and also Mr. Monroe would talk about what I see as the other half of the problem, which is the interrelating issues involving crime and drugs. Now, it seems to me that what we've seen in the last couple of years involving public policy towards drugs is that there's been more and more division in Congress and among opinion makers generally about how to deal with the drug problem. You have more and more people talking on the one hand about legalizing drugs as a more extreme sort of cutting the knot solution, and on the other hand you see that Congress is responding in precisely the opposite way by becoming more and more draconian in the way that drug dealers are treated, the way drug users are treated. It seems that more and more there's a division now between these two approaches, and I wonder if the two of you would try to comment on how you think the drug problem and the crime problem that relates to it should be dealt with.
Well, I think there's serious problems. I don't favor the legalization of drugs. I think on the one hand, you're seeing young men engaging in the drug traffic because the rewards are so high, even when you factor in the risk, and the alternative opportunities are inadequate. On the other hand, you have a demand for drugs that is driven, at least in part, by despair in people's lives and a sense of hopelessness. I think that, I mean, this is an obvious observation, but I'll make it anyway. There aren't that many black people who are bringing cocaine into the country from Colombia. That the larger issue, the larger issue of the supply of drugs is something that is really not within the control of inner city populations, or for that matter, of city governments or police forces or whatever. And it seems not to be that controllable even by federal efforts, although one could talk about, foreign policy issues and going to the source and that sort of thing, declaring war on a substantial part of rural South America and so forth. I think that that problem has to be approached from the demand side, that it has to be approached from the point of view of the treatment of people who are addicted and who want to get help. I think there ought to be treatment for drug addicts on demand, and inpatient treatment for people who want to go in and get help. That's expensive. One estimate I heard puts the figure at about $20 billion a year in order to be able to increase capacity to treat any addict who would seek assistance. But I think you can do the cost benefit on that and see that would be worth it. I think there also has to be an educational component, and I don't just talk about formal education, but also informally in the community itself, that the kind of message that a Minister Farrakhan would be known to put out about how it is that, in this case, black people, poor black people, have to think of themselves in terms of the threat that drugs pose, is in its various guises, maybe not just in the language of Minister Farrakhan, but he certainly and that movement have been successful on this front, has to be foisted in the community and continued. I mean, Reverend Jackson got a lot of press for going around to the high schools that he went to and telling kids, come forward and pledge not to use drugs and so forth, and I commend him for that. But I think what we need is that activity multiplied 1,000 times over and sustained over a long period of time in addressing that problem.
Briefly, I agree with everything Dr. Lowry said. I mean, all of those components are necessary, and ultimately, on the demand side, I mean, we have to have an atmosphere in which, I mean, there was a time in the 60s and early 70s when drugs were in, and peer pressure is a very powerful kind of thing, and we have to get to a point where they are now not in, where it is not cool, it is not the thing to do, and we have to move toward that way, because the demand side is where, I mean, there's too much money involved for us to deal with the supply side. We have to deal with the demand side.
We have a question over here.
This question is for Mr. Monroe. It concerns the media representation of blacks in the underclass. I was wondering, since they've exaggerated that perception, I was wondering what the actual numbers are, the actual percentages of blacks in the underclass.
I don't know the actual number. I mean, the
actual ballpark figure.
Do you know what percentage?
I would guess on the order of 10%.
Thanks.
You mean 10% of blacks?
10% of the black population being, quote, underclass.
Oh, I meant what percent of the underclass is black?
Well, there are various ways to measure it. I mean, 1/3, if we're talking about people, if we're defining it as people who seem permanently stuck in poverty, but people in poverty, let's just do people in poverty. The last numbers I saw was nearly 1/3 of black people in this country were below the federal poverty guidelines.
Yeah, and that's consistent with the statistics that Congressman Gray offered last night. I think he used a figure of actually 38% of black Americans living below the poverty level. Professor Lowry, were you about to?
Well, I was just going to say, I don't want to go off on a long thing about this, but there are lots of different ways of trying to define the underclass, and the underclass is not synonymous with poverty, and poverty in a given year is not the same thing as poverty for 10 years in a row. And if you're living in a, quote, ghetto, close quote, that's not the same thing as being poor and living in a not ghetto community. If underclass connotes the combination of a lot of different things going on, dilapidated housing, high crime rates, a concentration of poverty and so forth, then, so you get different numbers depending on the definition, that's all.
Which you did ask earlier, for us to stay where we're from.
Thank you for remembering.
I didn't forget that. I want to get that out. And last night, Representative Gray spoke about public policy, and both of you have tended to lessen the importance of public policy. I know that everything is important. We need to be heard everywhere, and I'm sure you would agree with that. But those of us who want to concentrate our efforts in the area of public policy, do you think that race-specific race-specific solutions to the poverty problem are bad, or do you think that a colorblind anti-poverty program would adequately address and solve the problems in the black poverty areas in this country?
Let me respond to that because it relates to something I wanted to say to a young woman who was up here earlier talking about AIDS. That there's a conflict between, on the one hand, casting the program in a way that it can appeal to a lot of people and therefore get political support, a broad base, and on the other hand, targeting the program so that the dollars that are spent are most effectively concentrated on the people who need it, the focus, okay, so the base versus the focus. From a political point of view, it seems pretty clear to me that non-race specific casting of programs is more effective because you get a broader coalition of support for the program. If you say, I want this for blacks, you have already built a mountain in front of yourself in terms of getting the thing passed. On the other hand, given the reality of budget processes, if you have it for everybody, if you have a benefit for everybody, by the time the dollars get spread around, the number of dollars that hit the people who need it most are low. So now that's a trade-off or a tension that nobody can resolve. I mean, it's just there. You need to then look at whatever the concrete specific thing is that you're talking about and try and figure out if it can't be tailored in a way that, you know, kind of balances those tensions. I guess just to try and direct, you know, get more specifically at your colorblind thing, I incline both on the politics of it and on principle toward trying to cast programs in a non-racial character, but to focus them on, quote, the truly needy, close quote. Okay, that kind of gets the best of both of these worlds. By casting it in a non-racial, I don't, you know, create these political problems for myself and get the backlash of people who say, you know, oh, blacks want special favors and so forth. And yet, by saying I'm going to make this available to whoever needs it, I do get some focus on the people that I would be most concerned about, whoever really needs it. So, you know, you hear some talk, it's not very politically popular, about, well, we have a budget problem, why don't we tax Social Security benefits such as are paid out to people who would be really very wealthy? Or why don't we means test the provision of health services or other kinds of publicly provided services to people, so as to make the, you know, a sort of graduated benefit depending upon the person's income. Now, there are other kind of incentive problems with that. You know, the conservatives will talk about, well, that'll give people an interest in not earning more income and stuff, and there's some merit in that. But it has the benefit of avoiding having to have an explicitly racial designation while at the same time trying to target the money toward people who really need it. There are a lot of race-oriented programs that are advocated in the interest or in the name of helping people who are badly off that don't necessarily redound to the benefit of people who are badly off. That's kind of another subject. But, you know, set-asides for minority businesses. We talk about, you know, the town is poor, it's got this many black people, minority businesses ought to get a break. Maybe that's so, but the net incidence of those benefits in terms of poor people, as best anybody can tell, is not that great. So there you kind of bad targeting plus, you know, racial specific focus of the program. Unless you're a businessman, it seems hard to me to support that. But that's another matter.
The only, you said our race-specific program is bad. The only bad thing I see about them, and I agree with a lot of what Dr. Lowry just said, the only bad thing about them is that you can't get them passed. I mean, they're getting tougher and tougher to be passed. Look at the recent Supreme Court decision on pass rent that you have to prove a specific injury, past injury, in order to do those kinds of set-aside programs. That's the only bad thing I see about them, that it's getting increasingly difficult to get them passed.
Let me add a point. I promised myself and other people that I would be merely a moderator, but I have to, on this particular question, say something because it's an issue I happen to know a lot about. There have been, in fact, recent examples of some successful legislative efforts that were race-specific. The one that comes to mind is that it was, I think, within the last 5 years that the U.S. Congress amended one of the federal laws that is the major federal law that gives money to historically black colleges and universities, so that there is, in effect, a set-aside within that program for them. They have always benefited heavily from the program, but in recent years, the extent to which they will benefit is set aside in the law. I shouldn't use the phrase set aside because it does conjure up the minority contractor set aside issue. But it is a race-specific law. It was passed in the, as I recall, it was since Reagan was president. So I'm not going to offer my own comments about the merits of it, but I do want to note that we are not yet at the point where certain kinds of things are politically achievable, even though they require the public policymakers to make a judgment that they are going to benefit black institutions. This side, I think it's the, or am I confused now? Okay.
Yes, my name is Greg Williams, and I'm a student at the Harvard Business School. Mr. Monroe, your comments troubled me concerning whether or not the media should not portray the black problem in poverty as a black problem. And the reason why that really bothered me is because when I hear on the news that it is a black problem, that triggers something in me and makes me want to do something. So I want to bring the discussion a little close to home this evening. I want to ask you two as black men, as a graduate of MIT and as a graduate of Harvard, what have you done specifically in your spare time to go back out into the community? And the reason why I'm asking you this is because if you've done something, then you can share with us and let us know what we can do. If you haven't done anything, then you can help us to understand why you're not doing anything.
Well, there is a sense in which if you get up in front of an audience like this, you put yourself on trial. I mean, just by posturing, by presuming to pronounce, you invite this. Let me just say this. I belong to a church over in Roxbury, and the church is active. You know, I, as a member, you know, get involved in programs and that sort of thing, but I'm not, you know, I'm not over there 5 days a week. I'm not over there 3 days a week. I go to a Bible study. I go to Sunday services, and the church does its thing. I am myself pretty active in drug self-help activities, drug rehabilitation and treatment activities, and work with a number of groups in Roxbury and Dorchester that are involved with recovering addicts.
That's a good question and a fair question. Those things that I talked about the young lady about making yourself available as a role model, speaking, being there. I speak, I mean, I go to the Robert Taylor homes. I go to Robert Taylor homes at least a dozen times a year. I go to places like the Robert Taylor homes. I speak to high schools all over this country. I mean, I'm on the road. I mean, my employers are so tired of me being gone, speaking to black kids, and any kids that want to hear me. When I leave here, I'm going to Philadelphia to speak to 2 black high schools Monday morning. I mean, I do that. I mean, as important as that, I mean, I talk to these people, I try not to preach to people. I mean, I go and I make myself available, and I ask people to ask me questions. The other thing I do, which I think is as important, is in my job as a journalist. I mean, I talk to you about perceptions. The only way they get broke is for somebody to break them. I mean, to reshape them. I try to do stories about people and in ways that aren't normally going to be done, because I mean, there are not many people in the world, I think, like me, who was born of a sharecropper's family in Mississippi, raised in the Midwest, educated at Harvard and Stanford. That gives me a particular window on the world. I try to write from that perspective, because I can see things on both sides. That's the way I write, and I try to do stories that people who normally work at places like Newsweek and Time and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal would not do. That's my contribution. It's what I try to give back.
Charles Witt from Cornell University, and my question kind of relates to public policy, but also more of institution building. And it's clear that the federal government and the state government set up institutions that just perpetuate the problem, where their answer to the problem is to put 27,000 or more men into a hotel while thousands of vacant homes stand abandoned in many of the cities. And my question is, what institutions should we, as African Americans, be, one, demanding of the federal government, and also be investing our money in and be supporting and trying to build ourselves so that we can alleviate the problem and make sure that the numbers just don't increase?
One of the institutions, the way the world works is such that, I mean, we talked about public policy and getting things done. How do you get things done? I mean, do you know how things get done on Capitol Hill? Lobbyists. Can you name me a black lobbyist or lobbying organization on Capitol Hill? Good. Right. Okay. That's Trans-Africa. And it is very important, and it's 10 years old, and what few sanctions and attention that has been brought to the apartheid situation in South Africa we might not have even that were it not for Trans-Africa. But name me one that lobbies for housing, for health care, for employment. Can you? Okay, well there's a start. Go ahead.
Are you saying that we should?
You said tell you what institutions, and you preface your question by talking about public policy.
Right.
If you want to affect public policy, I'm telling you the way the game is played. Black people must have a presence on Capitol Hill, a loud voice, and not just. I mean, the Black Caucus is there, but the Black Caucus is some 24 people. Where are black people? I mean, we always say, well, our congressmen not doing this, and they're not doing that, and they're not doing. Where are black people?
Professor Lowry, do you want to speak to that?
I don't have anything to add.
Well, then I'll take a moment. I spent 15 years in Washington, D.C., and most of the time I was a lobbyist. And I think it's a very good point that he's making. What I observed in those 15 years is that when you are talking about the issues that most directly affect black people, you are usually in a room where the legislator you're trying to affect is not black, where there's nobody on the staff who's black, and where you're in sometimes people lobby in groups and you're the only black lobbyist in the room. The other thing that I learned, however, is that an awful lot of people who don't work in Washington as lobbyists think that's dirty work. They think you go to Washington, you become a lobbyist, and you run around taking shady money from somebody to represent their dubious corporate interests. The pitch I make, though nobody asks me what I do in my spare time, but one of the things that those of us who've been in Washington and on the front lines of that lobbying do is try to get people like you to realize that one of the things you can do is be out there in the public policy arena, not necessarily running for office, because heaven knows that's not for everybody, but being involved in the political process in the very direct way that lobbyists get involved. And there are organizations that advocate all sorts of positive things in housing and health care and education, and many of those things benefit a lot of black people when they in fact happen. But the black presence and the black voice making the advocacy points in Washington is very, very seldom heard. And moreover, the black legislators, because I worked for 2 of them, 3 years in each instance, they don't hear very often from their black constituents. And they don't get enough people like you coming to Washington to work with them during the summers, during your externships and every other kind of program, and then making a decision that you're going to make your career in that arena. And if you think that being involved in elected politics requires you to decide that you're going to run for office, you're really losing sight of some tremendous opportunities to really make a very direct difference in public policy. That's my one speech. We'll turn here.
My name is Michelle Duncan, and I'm a freshman here at Harvard. And I was wondering why no one addressed the incredible amounts of money that are in the underclass or circulating among there that aren't documented because they're illegal. And maybe I see this because as a teenager, all around me, what I see are people dealing drugs with incredible amounts of money, incredible clothes, and incredible things. I mean, an inner city high school had to put a dress code on prohibiting gold jewelry, any type of leather, designer clothing. Why would that happen in an underclass environment if there wasn't, these amounts of money? And also, if this is going on, why would they want to go to a 9-to-5 job? I mean, these kids are like, what? You mean work from 9 to 5? Even if I could make $50,000 a year, that's what I'm making now. I'm 16. I have a brand new car, and I have no car payments. Why should I work? I mean, that's a big problem because there's no reason for them to want to come out of this so-called poverty because they're doing better than many other people.
There's one reason. And you're right. I said this earlier. How do you tell somebody? But the one thing about that is that if you go to school and you work hard and you get a job and you work, you don't have to look over your shoulder every day. You don't have to sleep with one eye open. The drug business,
they
the
have
drug
no
business.
future anyway.
Well, you're absolutely right, and we have to do something about that. We have to show people that there is a future. That the price is much too high for that kind of lifestyle. Now, I'm saying if I had the answer, I'd bottle it and make $1 million. I don't, but and nobody said it was easy.
Let me make 2 points. First of all, let's not engage in stereotypes here. In the same way that all women on welfare are not lazy and having babies out of wedlock rampantly, in the same way that all black men in the inner city are not criminals and drug dealers, just because a few people have gold chains doesn't mean that everybody's got money pouring out of their pockets. It's look at the economics of it. If you're selling cocaine on the block down there, you're selling it, that's not exactly heavy manufacturing.
No,
You
but
know what I mean?
I just
There's
a
not a
couple
lot
things
of turnover of those dollars.
One thing I just
Are you
want
following me?
I understand. I'm from Detroit, and we have all of our high school, all of the city high schools are basically black, and in any one of them, you walk in there, and you don't see anybody, or you do, but they're in the minority, in the corners, who is not dressed, who does not have chains. It's a really big thing. It's a really big part of the culture. And I know that those who are actually living in poverty exist, but I don't see that.
That's not a measure of the wealth of the community as much as it is a measure of the preferences of people as to how do they dispose of the little money that they've got.
Well,
I said we would stop at 8:30, but in fact, I realized that we didn't begin until about 20 past 7, and there are a number of people with questions. So what I'm going to suggest is that we continue for about another 10 to 15 minutes and get as many of the other questions in as we can in that time, recognizing that some of you may need to leave, but I think we should allow ourselves a full hour and a half that I had in mind when I gave the 8:30 limit. So I think we can get at least, I hope, 2 more questions in if our panelists can bear that time constraint in mind as well. Over here.
Hi. I'm a sophomore at Harvard, and my name is Carol. I'd like to direct my question specifically to Dr. Lowry. I'd like to know if you think that politics plays a large and important part in this problem, and if so, what effect the Reagan administration in specific has had on the underclass.
Well, I think politics plays a large role, although my opening comments were meant to suggest that I think it's taken by people often to be the whole problem, and that it's not. I don't think the Reagan administration has done very much for the underclass. I think that's pretty clear. I think the administration made its agenda clear from the very start. It wasn't inclined to support domestic programs. It made no particular effort to define and preserve assistance to the poorest of the poor, even as it said about trying to reduce federal government activity in the domestic area generally, and even as it engaged in a large defense buildup. For what it's worth, I can't endorse those values. I think that was a grave mistake, both in terms of the substance of the policy and also a grave political mistake. I think that you had people in that administration whose ideological fervor precluded the kind of subtle political judgment that would have been in the interest of their party to have fostered a more even-handed and, even if only superficially, humane posture. But on the other hand, I don't think the Reagan administration created the underclass or drove people into poverty either. I think it missed an opportunity to take a more proactive stance.
What do you think the Black can do in the political arena to alleviate the problem?
Let's try to weave that into his response as well in the interest of time.
One of the easiest things to do, simplest things to do, is to vote. I mean, when you look at the past elections and the number of, granted, people say, well, my vote doesn't count. When you look at the number of black people who simply, unregistered black voters and registered black voters, who simply did not go and vote in the last election, if black people had won, if all things being equal, if black people had wanted Jesse Jackson to be president or to at least be the Democratic Party nominee, just looking at the numbers now, if black people had voted and the other people got the number of votes they got, and black people had voted, just those registered, he could have easily won the primaries. All black people didn't vote, and then they sit around and they cry about what's going on. And nothing happening. I mean, I can't do this, I can't do that. I don't like what Ronald Reagan is doing. To the other part of the question, and I'll be brief, of what Ronald Reagan did, Ronald Reagan, I don't blame Ronald Reagan, but what I do blame is the Reagan administration set a climate in this country for meanness, for racial intolerance that is growing. And I see, and he said it by his policies. His own his own vote against extending the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He was against extending the Voting Rights Act. His attempt to gut the Civil Rights Commission, his attempt to give tax tuition credits to segregated schools. Those send a message. Those things send a message that it's okay to be anti-black, that it's okay to not deal with the problems of race and poverty. The difference between the Reagan administration and the 60s, when I said the 60s was a good time to be black, there was a willingness and a wherewithal to deal with the problems of race and poverty. We may not have had the answers, but people felt it's the right thing to do. Let's deal with it for whatever the reason. You don't have that much anymore. People now say, you've got Forsyth County, Georgia now, where people say, well, the blacks have Atlanta, Forsyth County is ours. We're going to stay over here. Or you've got, what's the name of that city in New York City? Howard Beach in New York, where people move from the city. And you would think in 1988 that people wouldn't feel like they had to fence themselves in or fence somebody out. Those kinds of things, I think, were fostered by the Reagan administration. They're not created, but they were not fostered, but perpetuated.
Okay, let's take a question on this side.
Moderator, my name is Randy Short. I'm from the Divinity School. I don't have a question, but I believe they made a point that they were willing to listen to some ideas. Okay, one thing I would make a point. I, too, work with the Academy Homes Project and also with the African People's Pentecostal Church Food Bank. That's what I do. Now, what I'd like to say to the people here is this. I think it's irrational to talk about problems that disproportionately affect black people as an American problem. Lynching was an American problem, but who got lynched? That's irrational to say that. And the other point that needs to be made, aside from looking at what the federal government's going to do, it's clear that there is a division between blacks, those that are poor and those that are not poor. I've lived below the median poverty level for 10 years of my life, and I've lived above it. And bourgeois blacks don't give a damn about poor blacks. They have money, they waste it, they're too busy trying to be something that they're not. And while we try, we are Americans, but we're black Americans. When Jews have a problem, Jews do something for Jews, but they're still Americans. Why, when we have a problem, we displace it on America? If we have a problem that goes back to since we've been here, not 1619, but 1526, then we need to deal with it rather than assume that the federal government's going to do it. What are we doing for ourselves? And to me, we'll never get our problems solved as long as we don't coalesce as an ethnicity and look at how we deal with self. Other people are going to always hate us. Racism is part of the culture. It's just like anti-Semitism. It's part of the culture in Germany or Austria. What are we going to do in the face of folks who don't like us?
That's very eloquent. And there's merit in what you say. But when I talk about American problem, I'm talking about ways of dealing with the problem. I mean, sure, you know and I know that it is a problem in the black community. But to define it as a black problem, we were just talking about a while ago. You're not. I mean, now, if we could solve it, I mean, do you have a job to give a black person? Do you control? What do you control?
Only thing that we can control is our minds, and that's something we don't control either.
Yeah, a valid point, very valid point. But what I'm saying is, when I'm talking about American problem, we live in America. There are institutions here. I mean, people need housing, they need jobs, they need health care. Can black people provide those?
Yes, if black people were to pool their money, they could do it. But that's something that people who are trying to assimilate into white mainstream America, the dream, instead of dealing with the black reality in which we live in, we're diffusing our energies. Our energies are going everywhere. Instead of saying, look, we're one people, whether we like each other or not, whether we're light-skinned or dark-skinned, how do we deal with the fact we've been here 400 years and we're divided? How do we come together? How do black intellectuals do something other than lecture at an Ivy League school and occasionally go and speak to blacks at some community group, or now and then you go to 12th Street Baptist Church and say, well, I go to a black church. That's a typical black bourgeoisie religion that has nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus or anything else.
Let me I'd like to comment briefly. I didn't say what church I went to, and I'm not saying.
Okay.
I agree with the young man, and have been saying a lot of that for a long time. I am puzzled by the following thing. The racist kidnapper who snatches blacks from Africa, enslaves them, and then mistreats them for 100 years is expected to respond to a moral appeal to do the right thing and deliver the underclass if we would but register and vote.
Exactly.
That perplexes me.
But I never made the point that there was just a racist kidnapper. We have to understand that, I agree with you, half of the problem is ours and the problem is someplace else. It's like being in a fight. It isn't...
I'm sorry. You've had a good amount of time. Yeah, like I said, I have a lot of political experience, and I know when the constituency has made a point. Go ahead.
It's like being in a fight. I can't be responsible for what the other person or how he's going to swing at me, but I can make sure when I swing back that I have my guard, I can protect myself. What am I doing for me? Now, as far as Africa goes, it's very clear that there are African bourgeoisie, who are just like our black bourgeoisie in America, that cooperated with the Europeans in selling Africans down the river. Those people like Mobutu, who exist to this day, are just like the black bourgeoisie here. I mean, Barry Gordy is the best example I can think of at the moment, where these black people make this money and do what they want to do, and they don't do anything to help anyone but themselves. And they say, I'm the only black person that's successful. I'm the only one who lives out here. Damn it, I'm glad. I hope no one else moves in because I'll lose my celebrity status.
I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think you made a very good point. I mean, you talked about reality, black reality. I mean, reality is never mind.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting that the most affecting comments here in a bourgeois audience of privileged people. Hey, you're at Wellesley, you're at Harvard, you're at Cornell, you're privileged. Hey, I mean, this is 1/10. You're at Northeastern. You're already ahead of the game. We talked about the underclass here
we
tonight.
get the bourgeois privilege because the federal government and the people that give financial aid that a lot of people would like to cut, that's why I'm here. I'm not here because I'm bourgeois. I'm poor.
You all are making my point. My point is, so profound is the confusion of identity and the dissonance with status that we really get worked up at a session on the underclass when we slash at ourselves for being bourgeois. Okay?
I'm not slashing bourgeois.
Well,
I'm slashing.
That's what I think is happening
I'm slashing the indifference of the people who have money.
One more question.
Mine is short.
From this side, and then we're going to have to end. I'm sorry.
My question is for Dr. Lowry. I wanted to ask you to evaluate very briefly some of the policy options that have been coming out of Washington in terms of invigorating the economy in black areas. Specifically, two that seem to be getting a lot of press are black enterprise zones and adjustments to the minimum wage. I would like to ask you what you think the cumulative effect of those things would be, whether if you think that they would be deficient, what other types of economic policies you might think would help stimulate black employment in the black economy. And finally, whether you think that perhaps a direct subsidy to a black entrepreneur class might make more sense than looking at particular wage policies and particular labor policies.
An economist to be brief on that question, but I'm going to have to do it anyway.
Okay, I'll try. I mean, enterprise zones are not a wage subsidy. That's tax abatement and the rest for people who locate in anything. That doesn't create skills for people, but it does create a demand for labor in the place where the businesses locate. My sense is it'll be positive, but no panacea. I mean, it would be helpful, but it would not be in any way adequate to deal with the problem. I think, and you know, I'm somewhat of a free market economist. I'm not in love with the idea of raising the minimum wage across the board, but I think that for low-income workers who are supporting households on their low-wage earnings, that raising the minimum wage is a pretty reasonable way to try and abate poverty in those households. My problem is, if you don't target the increase in the minimum, you get it for all kinds of people, you know, secondary workers and that, and it's not as effective. I think, though, that in the long run, increasing educational attainment and the quality of education, because the vast majority of this population is a laboring population. I'm not against seeing black businessmen be successful, but I'm suspicious of that, you know, program as a program for dealing with, quote, underclass problems, because usually they're just rents created for people who are already doing fairly well, and they do just that much better without much of it spilling over to the poor.
Okay, I'm sorry. I feel a responsibility as moderator to bring things to a halt. Unless, David, you want to give me some other instructions, I'm going to wind things up. I'm sorry. Okay, let's take one more, and then we're really going to have to bring it to an end.
Might as well take them both. I mean.
Okay, we've got. All right.
because I'm going to be brief.
Fair enough. We've got 2 more people at mics, and that will really have to be the end. David, help me out. You're in charge.
If we can keep the mics on for just a little while longer, we'll take off 3. So we can keep the mics on for a little while longer, then we should be able to take off.
Let me ask one other question. Are speakers able to stay a few minutes after the formal part and talk to some of these issues directly?
So not very long for me.
Okay, not very long, but a couple of moments. All right, we'll take this one here.
I get the feeling that that one of the assumptions of a gathering like this is that everybody sort of agrees that that folks should somehow run out to the black community or give money or do something. I've been a student here. Well, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Jeff Ferguson, first-year graduate student here in American Civilization. I've been a student here for a while, and I really feel like people come to conferences like this to get some idea of why they should do something, and if they're doing something, why they should continue. In other words, there's some sort of moral question behind that. Why should anybody do anything for these people? Why do you, if you can't answer that, because there may not be an across-the-board sort of answer to that question, why do you do what you do?
I think each person has to answer that question ultimately for himself, but there is a reason. Why do I do it? Because, one of the things, if I could just aside for a minute, and I know I'm supposed to be brief here, but I'll stay as long and answer questions as long as you want. The brother that was here a little bit before disturbed me because he was articulate and he made a point that I did not disagree with, that I agree with. But what disturbed me was that 15 years ago, I was here standing at a microphone talking about, who's black enough. That's what that's about. Bourgeois, da-da-da. Ultimately, when you look at the reality of this country, it does not matter. It does not matter whether you are bourgeois or low or what. If you are black in this country, there is a certain reality that you deal with. And the reality may be you may have a few more dollars in your pocket at one level of that reality, but there are ceilings. What I'm saying is there are artificial ceilings on your achievement, on your accomplishment, on your dreams even. I can't look at. You sit here and some of you may look at me with scorn and say, well, I work for Time magazine and I do thus and such. But there are ceilings on me. I am not the editor of Time magazine. I am not likely to be the editor of Time magazine. No. Yeah.
That's your issue.
Yes.
It's a different issue than simply saying, as a black, I'm not going to be editor of Time magazine, as opposed to saying I have all the qualifications to be an editor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was implied. Anyway,
So this is a matter of your own personal gain.
Gain?
Yes.
No, not gain.
Well,
you mean to come? Why?
Yeah. Why should you do anything for poor black people?
Because I feel a kinship with poor black people. My mother. When I was at Harvard, this may not be, the brother that talked there, when I was at Harvard, I lived in Leverett House. I had a view of the Charles River. I lived better than I had ever lived in my life. My 5 sisters and my brother and my mother lived in the Robert Taylor homes. How in the world could I say, I made it, I got it made, I worked hard? That's just something that, personally, I'm saying, every person has to decide that personally. I'm telling you why I do. Mm-hmm. Because I don't see a whole lot of difference. I wear nice suits and I work at a nice magazine, but I run into the same things that many other people run into in this country. There is a kinship. There is a link.
Let me push you one step and then I'll shut up.
Sure.
I just want to say that one of the reasons I think you end up having conferences like this, and what I was saying about people wondering why they should, is that kinship that you're talking about, that assumptive link, seems to me to be deteriorating.
It is deteriorating.
And so how can you speak? I mean, you feel that link, great. But how can you speak to those people, many of whom have, lots of money, lots of ability, lots that they could put into this question, but just question, why should I do anything? I mean, you can say, I feel a link, and you can spew forth all the, kind of nationalist slogans you want if you want to get on the radical side of that question. But that doesn't speak to these people, and they end up being fairly talented folks.
Well, I don't know. I'm not quite sure. I mean, are you looking for a reason?
I'm asking you to address your audience.
I think that, I mean, that's not, as I told you, that's not something that I look out of this audience and I say everybody in this audience ought to go do something for thus and such. People have to decide for themselves why. I mean, many people, and I think if it works, use it, but it's the wrong reason. Many people do it not because they feel any kinship or because they feel it's right. They do it out of guilt.
Let me say something briefly here. I think that that's a very uncomfortable line of questioning. I tried to suggest this earlier in response to the other question, that the subtext here has to do with our identities and feelings about ourselves as much as it has to do with, quote, the underclass over there. And that the painful issues attendant to assimilation and social mobility that we all have to face, I face them too. I'm not going to trot out my ghetto bona fides. I'm not going to prove anything to you by telling you how many people I know, lived with, grew up with, where I've been, what has happened, and so forth. You just have to wonder about that. But the issue of authenticity, of being really black, of being connected, and the extent to which that reality resides, if only mythically so, in some underclass over there, even as the reality of our own lives passes on to Wall Street, Time Magazine, professor at Harvard, and so forth, is a deeply troubling, emotional, and psychological issue that we are all beset with and has something to do with our political behavior around this. I'm not making any accusations, okay? I'm reporting to you from observation and from introspection. And there's no easy answer. There's no easy way to get to sleep comfortably at night, not really knowing and feeling totally secure with who you are and with what you're doing when you look out across the street, across the city, and you see something else that's going on. I think that's part of what's at stake in the question and in the response.
Okay, over here.
My name is John Last. I'm a former college professor. I would like to, we cannot hear it. Can we hear it? Okay. I would like to address this question to Mr. Monroe. I have the feeling that black professionals have thought about this, but I nevertheless like to ask the question. I wonder whether black professional persons in this country have tried to explore avenues for professional employment in African countries, for example, for the purpose of increasing and fostering black relations in root countries in Africa, to learn extra and pick up extra know-how from African experience. 3, to enjoy fellowship in good relations in a native African black country and environment. And I wonder whether these professionals have thought about periodically returning to the United States and sharing their experience with individual black communities in this country, and whether black businessmen have ever thought about similar methods of exploratory and investigative know-how nature in which they could enrich the American black community. If there have been, please let us know for the benefit of this young population.
Okay, we have time for another quick answer. I know the young woman over here is very anxious to ask her question. She sat down when I think she guessed that I was about to wind things up, even though I hadn't said that. Bess, if you'll answer as quickly as you can, I will let her put her question, and then we are really going to have to stop at that point.
Yeah, that's not new. People have been doing that, and with varying degrees of success. Louis Farrakhan, for one, has done a great deal of that kind of thing. Jesse Jackson, in his own way, in his many travels, has brought information back and forth. And then the unnamed businessmen are doing that kind of thing.
This is really the last question.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, I just have one quick comment, one quick question. This word bougie, that supposedly equals rich, and the fact that all the people in this room somehow are bougie, which means they equal rich, I think that ignores some people in this room that have to live in two realities. I'm not one of them, so I'm not going to pretend that I am. But I know of a lot of people who go to school who go back to poverty. So just because you're rich just because you're here doesn't mean necessarily you're part of this bougie life. And secondly, there's a question that's been asked 3 times. I don't think it's really been answered yet, so I wanted to ask it just once more. It really troubles me, the idea of putting everyone together, of this broad-based, colorblind kind of legislation. I feel it leads to color unconscious programs that tend to ignore African Americans completely. We become invisible. I realize that public policy and putting things through the old white male system is not going to cut it. And I think that you reiterated that every time someone is asked a question. So now the question becomes, is there anything we can do outside of that? Is there anything we can do, as the woman in Chicago, I forget her name, I'm sorry, who works within housing, whether it's her housing complex, to try to better that? Is there anything we can do, in our schools, in our communities, by ourselves, without having to get big old white man to write his name down to the piece of paper? And if there is, what are those types of things? We realize, we understand we can't go through Capitol Hill, but is there anything that we can do on our own? That's what's important now, is what we can do on our own.
The panelists saying that none of them said you can't do anything through Capitol Hill, and ask them to go past that point and comment on the balance of Earth.
Just very briefly, I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot that you can do, and I don't know all of the things that people might think of to do, but there are kids that need tutoring. There are people that need big brothers and big sisters. There are schools that need people to come in and work with people. I think there is practically unlimited agenda of that kind of self-help, voluntary, intra-group, and so forth activity that people can engage in. Yes, I think there's a lot that you can do.
I think that's what we've been talking about all night. I mean, we certainly didn't say that you had to go to Washington. I said I talked about how things are done in Washington, how legislation is passed. But for the most part, we talk about the lack of black people's voices in Washington. Where things really get done, where it affects your lives, is at the local and state government level. And the local and state government are full of black people and run by black people. And that's where you really need to have your voice heard on anything. From getting your garbage picked up to getting better health care and better schooling and better schools and whatnot in your communities. There's a lot you can do down at that level.
Okay, we're going to have to wind up. I think David will take over the mic for a minute and maybe have some announcements about the balance of the conference. Thank you, everyone.
I would just like to thank Ms. Spence and Professor Lowry and Mr. Monroe for agreeing to participate in this discussion. I think a lot of interesting topics were covered, and I hope you'll give further thought to these topics. At this time, I'd like to remind people that following this presentation at around 10 o'clock in the North House dining hall, there's going to be a mixer where there are going to be refreshments, there's going to be some music. If you want to go and just sit, there's no admission fee. So if you don't have any plans for this evening, if you'd like to come and just interact with the rest of the conference participants, that opportunity is available to you. I'd also like to ask that the leaders of the contingents from each respective school hang around after this presentation and meet in the Institute of Politics living room, because some things that we have to discuss with you. Other than that, if you're not going to be at the mixer this evening, then make sure that you're back here tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock for our next presentation. Thank you very much.